Hello, good evening, and welcome. My goodness, I sound like David Frost from the 1970s. Hello, good evening, and welcome. It's Wednesday evening. I think that's the 24th of March. And this week, I tasked myself with doing two videos originally. I was going to do a talk on the business of belief. That's to say, the philosophical ideas behind the concept of belief and what belief was supposed to mean in both the practical usages of it and the way in which we think about it in the realm of philosophy. And then I was also going to do something that I've never done before, which was to produce a coming out video. Many transgender people these days seem to do that. It seems to become kind of almost a public statement of intent. For me, it never happened because it's 13 years now since I actually came out as transgender, and in the process of doing that, I didn't have the facilities to make a video all those years ago, and consequently, it's always been one of those things that I've sort of dismissed out of hand. Really, I just didn't feel the need to do it. However, I was inspired by the work of one Abigail Thorne recently, who made a really rather good coming out video for YouTube. And in the process of doing that, she demonstrated how drama and thinking and considerations of gender all fit together in a quite neat little package. Now, let me put it this way. I don't have the video skills nor the acting skills for that. I'm not an actor. I'm a teacher who happens to teach philosophy. And consequently, I'm what you might call a professional talker. it's, it's it goes with the job almost. As most of my students know, shutting me up is the difficult thing to do, not getting me started. It's both a boon and a burden to carry, I suppose, in some respects. And based, I suppose, on the very thing I was talking about earlier on, about this issue of belief, and especially belief in oneself. I sometimes think my habit of talking a lot is about trying to put over the idea of a certain degree of self-belief, which may not be present necessarily in the fact that I seem to be very voluble. I suppose in some respects I'm very like my mother, who used to fill every possible moment of the day with something to say, and was very worried. I would even say afraid of the idea of silences. She would always say something, and I'm a little bit like her. But to get back to the subject, there was two videos I was wanting to make. One was about belief, and the other one was about being transgender and coming out as transgender. And then I thought, well, why not, instead of making two videos, merge both of them into one? Because the thematic material from both of these provides quite a good linkage between these two ideas, and especially about the business of personal identity and how personal identity works. It also brings up subjects such as what it is to believe something, what it is to know something, and what it is to have faith in something, I suppose. And the way those kind of words can often be weaselly in some respects, weasel words that sometimes give a false impression. So, this is my attempt to merge a coming out video with a, a philosophical examination of the idea of belief. And I really do think this might be an interesting approach to this particular traditional prospect that someone in my position might engage in at this time. When I was younger, a lot younger, back in my youth, I'm now 65, so this is quite a long time ago. The idea of being transgender was not something that ever came to mind, and that's not because I didn't have uncertainties about myself, but because the word didn't exist. The word transgender wasn't known and never heard. And I can't really put my finger on when I first heard the word, but it certainly wasn't in my youth. And it probably wasn't for much of my adulthood either. Other words were known, usually spoken of with a great degree of taboo around them, such as, dare I say it, transvestite, or even worse, transsexual. And both of those words were spoken of with a certain degree of apprehension in society in which I lived when I was growing up in the 1950s and 1960s. This is not because the 1950s and 1960s were somehow repressed. I think it was because at the end of the day, people really weren't accustomed to the idea of what gender issues of one sort or another were, and in the process of doing that, had no way of really talking about them other than either the repression-orientated vision of what alien psychology of somebody who dressed in women's clothes was all about, or the medicalized version of things that you see in the word transsexual. In other words, the idea being something that was either about clothes or it was about, the bodily changes that transition bring about. And I was a victim of that as much as anybody else during this period. So as a child, the whole idea of accepting that there might be something interesting about me, which was not simply to do with the business of being, an awkward child, as I very much was, didn't occur to me. Didn't occur to me that was possible at all. In all of this, therefore, there is a degree of uncertainty. My beliefs about myself were based on what I knew at the time. My beliefs about myself are also based on the accommodation that I made towards the society in which I lived in. That society which was based upon, as you might say, a vision of the world which was fairly secure. Children need a certain degree of security about the way the world around them works, and parents feel that it's their duty, as good parents, to provide that length of and the breadth of security, which I guess means that there is a kind of stability in the world in terms of its concepts, its images, its templates that children are exposed to. Parents and other caregivers and our teachers at school and everybody else we come into contact who has goodwill towards us, just with the best possible ideas in mind. They're not out there to cause us to become horribly repressed individuals. They just do it because they think it's the best thing to do. And, I can't see that my mother or my grandparents or anyone else in my life did anything else other than that. It's not their fault that society wasn't more informed. So I grew up with beliefs around gender, which were the fairly standard ones. There were only two genders. And those genders were mapped against, isomorphically mapped, you want a really complicated word, mapped against the idea of sex, or sex and gender, in effect, were interchangeable terms. So, there wasn't any confusion about that. If somebody mistakenly said, "What's your gender?" and then later on said, "What's your sex?" I would automatically have thought male and boy, as it was at that particular point in time. Even at that time, I felt at odds with myself. Now, being at odds with oneself is, I think, something that quite a lot of people go through in their lives. I think women go through it quite a lot. They grow up into a society that expects them to behave in certain ways, and then suddenly discover how inadequate they feel about being that person. The person that's supposed to be a wife, supposed to be a mother, that's supposed to be a good worker, that's supposed to be content with her lot and not be too upset about the idea of not being paid the same as men, the idea of having to put up with the idea of violence in society, and all the rest of it that goes with it. Those unspoken hegemonic templates, as you might say, that form the business of what and I use the word loosely, normal life might be. Now, I hate the word normal, many people will know that, but I'm using it to describe what that kind of normalcy might have felt like in the era which most of us, engage in. The idea that there is something about normalcy which is out there, which we should be achieving, and at the end of the day, if we don't feel happy with that, well, it's our fault, not the rest of society. So there is this whole issue about us fitting in, which I think women feel, and sometimes men do too, about who they're supposed to be. And I felt that throughout my entire life, but I thought it was just an average thing to have. The fact that I had a really horrible time as a child, that I felt really out of it in terms of school and growing up and puberty and all the rest of it, didn't occur to me as anything other than something I beat myself up for. My beliefs systems, my knowledge of myself, and my faith in my, you notice I'm using those words deliberately, were based upon these particular precedents, these predicates within my world, which I had not had anything to do with. I was just, as existentialists might say, I'd been thrown into the world and then had to deal with it on its own terms. As a child, that's really difficult. As a teenager, even worse, I suppose. And as an adult, one then finds out oneself trapped within a system of belief and a system of knowledge of oneself, which is often at odds with the reality of the situations one encounters. So, let's deal with the business of belief, knowledge, and faith. When one uses the word belief, very often it deals with a kind of, I suppose you might say, a variety of contextual uses that the word has got. If I say, for instance, I believe today is Wednesday, without looking at a calendar, then of course that sort of assertion of belief, which it sounds like the kind of thing you see in philosophical textbooks, is about a demand or a statement about the world which can be tested through evidence. So I could say today's, it's from the point of view of philosophers and from the point of view of human beings, it's human beings. What I mean to say is average human beings, not philosophers. There is a sense that it's about this business of saying today is Wednesday, and I can be wrong about that. As it happens, I'm right because I know today is Wednesday. I can then say that I know today is Wednesday. There is some factual evidence around me which can verify that fact. I don't have to have faith in the idea it's Wednesday. The only faith I have to have in, I suppose, at the end of the day would be something extreme, like if there was some doubt about the way the calendar worked. So, to summarize the whole business of, in a very brief methodology, to summarize the whole business of belief, knowledge, and faith, belief tends to be the kind of thing that can be asserted by someone about the world in which they live, which can be tested in some respects. And when it's tested and becomes assured in terms of its veracity, it then becomes what you might call knowledge. And this can vary from the most trivial aspects of one's life down to the most profound issues that one can be concerned about. Having said that, there are some statements about the business of belief which sound as if they're the same phraseology as statements of belief that can be verified, which are not really at all. I might say, I believe myself to be a woman. And that particular phrase sounds like as if it might be a statement in the same vein, because it uses the same kind of phrasing as I believe today is Wednesday. But in fact, it's a totally different qualitative statement. It's not a statement of fact. There is no way, in many respects, anyone would need to use that phrase, I believe I am a woman, because that never occurs in day-to-day life. The only time it would occur if there was such a thing as doubt about it, where such a thing might be stated in moments of great self-doubt. Rest of the time, nobody who exists within let me rephrase that. Mostly nobody who lives within the kind of practical exigencies of the world in which we inhabit usually says things like, I believe that I'm a woman, unless it's being questioned in some way. This particular issue, I think, is at the heart of what you might call the transphobic experience that we have in the world around us today. That question of belief is something that's only transferred on people like myself in occasions when we need to make some sort of effort to show proof about our womanliness or maleness, for that matter, if you happen to be approaching things from the opposite gender spectrum. So in some respects, that word, I believe I am a woman, wouldn't occur to the average woman in the street, the average woman sitting watching this, the cisgendered woman sitting watching this at this very moment. It doesn't occur to them because the business of her gender is enacted in her manner of life, in the way in which she operates, in the things she does, in the way in which those templates which society has thrown out at us and which are evolving over time provide a framework to relate to in which this business of identity can be justified and elaborated and demonstrated, in society. Now, this doesn't mean to say you have to follow those templates. It just means to say that there is some relationship with them of some sort. In other words, even those people who say to themselves, "I want to reject the template of the standard gender binary, uh, 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 from my world. I want to totally reject it altogether," are reacting against those sorts of standardized templates, those normalized templates, which at the end of the day provides the point of reaction, which enables them to form new theories about who they might be. So we're stuck with the business of either conforming or reacting in one way or another, and our belief systems tend to be based upon those particular aspects of societal traditions, societal superstitions, almost in some respects. Knowledge, on the other hand, seems to come from the business of experience of the world itself. So as I've gone through the past 13 years after I came out as transgender, what I was doing, in fact, was enacting something in the world in which I was learning how to be in this role. I wasn't doing it on the basis of someone who handed me the manual on day one and said, "Here you are, this is what being a woman is all about. All you have to do is wear this frock and these shoes and this makeup and this hair and everything will be fine," because that representational system needs to be enacted in the world via some sort of practical experience, by being, as you might say. And in this, I'm very much in line with the way in which Simone de Beauvoir operates in terms of her statement about, women are not born, they are created. And in the process of creation, one finds out who one is in the practice of enactment of one's gender within society, which elaborates the business of who you become over time. Gender is not an issue of knowing at the outset. It's a matter of becoming. And that becoming is very much the kind of way in which knowledge is acquired over time and is assimilated, and then through the feedback loops of practice and getting feedback from other people and feedback from the world and feedback about yourself, you gain greater and greater refinement about how those enactments actually operate. If you want to cut it to the chase, I suppose you could say you get better at the role as time goes on, and put it in a way. And that's exactly what happened to me. In the initial stages, I was very clumsy about all this. Didn't know how to handle it. Didn't know who I really was, even in the new role. I felt very much at odds with myself as I grew older as an adult, and very much more at odds with myself as I grew into my late 40s and early 50s, when the midlife crisis of identity takes over anyway. And on the basis of how I felt about myself, I felt increasing pressure to do something about this gross uncertainty that infected my life from my earliest days. The difference was I had heard the terms transgender. I now knew what that word meant. I knew the term transvestite. I knew the word transsexual. I knew the various other terminology that went with it: male to female, female to male, cisgender. I'd learned these things through the business of encountering them, not just in books, but in the practical usage within the new burgeoning internet that had existed. You could say that I'm a child of the internet, much in the same way as I'm a child of the 1950s and 1960s. My rebirth was based upon the business of the internet, much to, I suppose, the shock, amazement, and horror of people around me at the time who felt that, their bliss was in my ignorance in some ways. They were much happier when I was ignorant than when I was aware, and that knowledge had somehow given me an almost, supernatural transformational force within my life. Well, that's the issue, isn't it? Knowing is transformational when it's taken on board in a real sense, when it's not just something you can recite back in an exam. It's something that you take towards your heart, take it within your emotional and existential being within the world. When you act out the knowledge that you have, something that's usually referred to in some philosophical circles as praxis. The idea there is a praxis about knowing about what it is to be trans and acting in such a way, in collaboration with other people who've had experiences of this sort before. And I think this is how knowledge works. I think this is a good example of how knowledge works within the world. Knowledge becomes enacted in the world. Knowledge becomes real to people because of the way in which it's used. Knowledge becomes not just something that's in the individual mind, but is part and parcel of the social business of being alive, acting with other people, sharing with other people, and behaving in certain ways with other people, which provides a framework where knowledge becomes a practical act. Belief, on the other hand, is the kind of seed of that. It's the where things begin. It's about the assertion of those sorts of potential practical activities, those practices, which have not yet given birth, as you might say, in lives outside society. Somebody was asking me also about the business of faith. I've always diagnosed faith and thought of faith as a commitment. Faith is a commitment to a particular kind of life, a kind of way of doing things in the world, a kind of approach which means one acts in a certain way, even when sustaining evidence and sustaining belief systems and sustaining templates that exist in the outside world are sparse, non-existent, or maybe contrary in many ways. Faith applies a certain degree of emotional aptitude towards particular kinds of ways of living. And I think I've seen this in the lives of people who have had religious faith around me, in which it's not just the business of saying, I believe in God, but actually they're used to the word, I believe in God, to be the business of an enactment of practices within their lives which make them different from every other human being. In other words, they don't just say it, they live it as well. And I've always believed that faith was about that, probably more than anything else. Faith wasn't necessarily about the business of proof, because if it was about proof, then we'd be back to the old business of the contrast between belief and knowledge. And I don't think that's something that is necessarily part of faith. However, having said that, I don't think you can use the word faith in the process of being transgender. I can't say to you, I have faith in my transness. I don't. It's something I am and something I do. I don't need to believe it, because neither do cisgender men or women need to believe it. I no more need to believe it than they do. If you're listening to this and you were born male and you're still living male, or you're born female and are still living female in your life, then I don't suppose you wake up in the morning and ever have to ask yourself whether you are male or female. It's just something you do, not something you believe. Your knowledge of it is by the interactions you have in the world, how it works within the frameworks that society offers, which construct what male and female in gender terms might operate. You don't even really use our biology to sustain it. What you tend to do is use the way that biology is orientated within society, and the way in which that biology is used as categories within which behaviors are legitimized. They're made true or false depending on the way society accepts them. Males who behave a certain way are seen to be males because behaving that way is true in the broadest sense in society, and the same with females. Now, you may object to that, but I think it's one of the issues that tends to be contentious within society when people start to doubt the femaleness or maleness of transgender people, because they assume that those kinds of categorized enactments are being falsified somewhere by the existence of transgender people, when they're not. We simply behave within the categories that society gives to us. If society was otherwise, we too would be otherwise. And I think that particular process is something which is pretty evident from the evidence around you. I think it's pretty much well known. So coming out for me in 2008 was a revelation. It was a revelation in two ways. First of all, I started to learn about myself in a way that I'd never done before. Secondly, I've discovered that learning about yourself can be both constructive and destructive. I'll learn about myself in the sense that my activities within the world, and who I was and how I dressed and how I talked and who I spoke to and what events I went to and how my relatives and friends reacted, all taught me a little bit about how the world operates in circumstances when unpredictable issues suddenly come to light within social frameworks. That was not an easy task. It is still not an easy task. It is also fed into me a certain sense of doubt, which is one of the reasons why this video needed to be made at all. Because as someone who has taught philosophy now for 25, maybe longer years than that, I have often found that it prompts me to start asking questions that other people wouldn't. So a lot of people who are transgender will look at this and say, my God, she's ranting on about philosophy again. But for those of you who are saying that, please remember, this is my job, this is what I do. And as Socrates was once prone to say, the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, this is an ongoing story. The business of coming out is not something that just happens on a particular date. This, like becoming a woman or becoming a man in the process of childhood, puberty, and adult development, is the same thing that I have discovered over the past 13 years. I'm going through a similar sort of process of becoming. This becoming is not an end in itself, but something which develops over a long period of time. And that phenomenon is something which I think is a hopeful thing for me. I think, every day I learn something new about me and about other people and about how the world wags and who wags it, to quote T.H. White. So this whole business, I think, has been a very optimistic thing, but it has been tough as well. To those who are listening to this who are closeted transgender people, I say to you that hopefully you start to realize that your identity is valid because of its enactment by what you do, not because of what you believe or even how other people feel about you. It's how you act that makes you what you are. And I think those sorts of issues mean that there is a certain consolation that even if you're in the closeted situation where you can't be out on a full-time basis or out there in the world being you as you would expect yourself to be as this developmental, becoming person, I think there is at least some consolation in the fact that your identity is no less valid than mine is. For those of you who are in doubt about your identities, don't worry, we all are, but not in the sense you think. Your doubt is not phrased upon any uncertainty within yourself, but phrased upon your need for this cognitive apprenticeship, this business of learning about yourself as the world develops. And as such, I think that is another optimistic side. You may not feel certain about yourself today, but give it time. You probably will feel certain about yourself, or at least less uncertain about yourself as time goes on. I think that's been an experience that I've felt very strongly over the past 13 years. So that was my attempt to fuse two different videos. I probably made a huge mess of it. If I did, sorry about that. If I didn't, thank you for your attention and for your kindness at putting up with me talking to camera. I shall now take this away, put some music to it, edit it, and so on and so forth. Thanks again, and goodbye. See you next time.